interpretation, dynamic interpretation, is not used only by the European Court of Human Rights, and it's not only used for human rights treaties. We can give one example before the International Court of Justice. It's in the Gavšíkovo-Nagymaros case, Hungary and Slovakia. The court decided on that case in 1997, and the question was the implementation of a treaty that has been concluded in 1977 between Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Well, the court wishes to point out that newly developed norms of environmental law are relevant for the implementation of the treaty, so the 1977 treaty, and that the parties could, by agreement, incorporate them in the treaty, in the 1977 treaty. These articles do not contain specific obligations of performance, but requires the parties in carrying out their obligations to ensure that the quality of water in the Danube River is not impaired and that nature is protected, to take new environmental norms into consideration when agreeing upon the means to be specified in the joint contractual plan. By inserting these evolving provisions in the treaty, the parties recognize the potential necessity to adapt to protect the project. Consequently, the treaty is not static and is open to adapt to emerging norms of international law. So, it's quite the same zoning that we've seen for the European Court of Human Rights. The treaty is not static. The European Court of Human Rights said that the treaty or the convention is a living instrument, so that is almost the same idea. So the treaty is not static. It is open to adapt to emerging norms of international law. Here, because the treaty, the 1977 treaty, stated that in carrying out their obligations, the states have to ensure that the quality of water in the Danube is not impaired and that nature is protected, etc., etc. If you say that nature has to be protected, of course, the meaning of this in 1977 is not the same today. Because when you say that you have to protect nature, in the 70s, the protection of nature was something very, it was not a developed field of international law. Today, the protection of nature, the rules of environmental law of course have increased. There are some new obligations binding states regarding the protection of the environment, and as the 1977 treaty only stated by nature has to be protected and that the quality of water in the Danube shall not be impaired, the treaty can be interpreted by as if the treaty was incorporating some new environmental norms, and the interpreter has to take into consideration some new environmental norms, even if those norms of environmental law did not exist in 1997 when the negotiators decided to conclude the treaty. is that you can interpret the treaty and identify the meaning of the provisions by taking into consideration some norms that did not exist at the time the treaty was signed, at the time the treaty was negotiated and concluded. Okay, so it is the same reasoning before the ICJ and before the European Court on Human Rights. Okay. So, well, these are the basic principles regarding the interpretation of treaties. So, textualist, mostly Article 31, intentionalist, mostly Article 32, and we've seen that it's only a secondary mean of interpretation, and teleological, in Article 31, when the Article 31 refers to the purpose, the object and the purpose of the treaty, and this may have some consequences on the dynamic evolution, the dynamic interpretation of the treaty. Okay, so that's okay. Here we go. So we will see now a second point on interpretation. We will discuss what we call the systemic integration interpretation, or systemic interpretation. Okay. And we will explain the meaning of Article 31, 3c. Okay. So that shall be taken into account together with the context of any relevant rules of international law applicable in the relations between the parties. Okay? So Article 31, 3c, that shall be taken into account together with the context of any relevant rules of international law applicable in the relations between the parties. So, what is the rationale for such a provision? What is the meaning of this? Or why did states decide to incorporate Article 31.3c in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties? What could be the meaning of this? What's behind Article 31.3c? What could it mean? It's quite easy. What does it mean for the, well, let's say we have the litigation before the International Court of Justice. What does it mean to say that or to interpret a treaty, the International Court of Justice shall take into account the context and any relevant rules of international law applicable in the relations between the parties? Why should the International Court of Justice do that? what do we try to do by imposing to the International Court of Justice to take into account any relevant rules of international law applicable in the relations between the parties?
Because some states, they have a special agreement or something, probably.
Yeah.
And when the court decide the case, that rule can be applicable in some specific conditions.
We're getting close. Is it a question of applicable law? Well, the answer is no. Why isn't it a question of applicable law? So we're working on Article 31(3)(c). That should be taken into account together with the context of any relevant rules of international law applicable in the relations between the parties. When we discuss Article 31(3)(c), we say that this provision refers to the systemic integration interpretation. What could that mean? Systemic integration interpretation. By let's say you have a dispute, a litigation between A and B, okay? And there is a treaty, and the international treaty AB, okay? And some provisions of the treaty, the meaning of some provisions is disputed between A and B, so in the International Court of Justice. Let's say we are before the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice has to interpret the provisions. What Article 31 says is that you have to integrate in good faith, etc., etc., etc. And also, they should be taken into account together with the context of any relevant rules of international law applicable in the relations between the parties. Is that you will identify the rules of international law applicable between A and B, and this may have an influence on this, on the interpretation of Treaty A and B. Why do we say that those rules of international law applicable between A and B should be taken into account by the interpreter of Treaty A-B? What's the idea behind this? What is the idea supported by this provision, Article 31(3)(c) of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties?
Maybe they want the enforcement of the treaty to be in the same
it means that, well, let's say, I don't know, let's say that in treaty AB, okay, there's provision stating that the states A and B shall protect the environment. Okay. If the dispute between A and B is about the definition of this, what is the environment? Is it only the land environment, or also the maritime environment, or the atmosphere, or etc., etc. If there are some rules applicable between A and B, let's say a treaty between A, B, C, and D, okay? A binding treaty on A, B, C, and D. If in that treaty, which is applicable to A and B, if you have a definition of the environment, you will presume that you will have the presumption that the meaning of this is the same here. If you have the same words in two treaties, if you have the same expressions in two treaties or several treaties, you can think, or it's legitimate to think that the meaning is the same in both treaties or in all the treaties. So if you have a clear definition of the notion of environment in the treaty A, B, C, D, and if states A and B have negotiated and adopted a treaty in which the term environment is used, you can believe that, or in good faith, you can believe that the meaning of environment in treaty A, B is the one that is identified in the treaty between A, B, C, and D. Okay? Mean that there is, this method of interpretation supports the idea that the treaty is not isolated from the other rules of international law. Mean that international law is a system, an international legal order, and in that international legal order, well, you cannot isolate one rule from the others. So when you interpret one treaty, you shall take into account other rules of international law applicable between the parties to the treaty that you have to interpret. Okay? So that's the reasoning between Article 31(3)(c). We will explain this in depth. Can you try to identify circumstances for which this solution is obvious or is self-evident? Means to take into account the normative environment of the treaty. Means the other rules applicable between the parties. Can you see one situation, one legal situation in which or for which to take into account the other rules of international law may be self-evident or is an absolute requirement? Do you know what? Well, maybe it's going to be quite difficult to. You know what is this? Do you know what is this? The framework framework treaty.
Like similar to the limitation, something like the scope of the treaty.
Well, of course.
That's what how treaty works and
What? Sorry.
and how treaty works and these kind of points that treaty is applicable or treaty is acknowledged or something like this.
Not really. The framework treaty, it's a type of treaty, or kind of treaty that is mostly used in international environmental law. Do you know what is the common method to adopt a treaty in the field of environmental law? What is specific to environmental law or environmental issues?
United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Sorry?
United Nations Framework Convention
On climate change, yeah. But well, it's a framework convention. What does it mean that the Convention on Climate Change is a framework convention? What's the difference between, how can we make a distinction between, on one side, the framework conventions, and on the other side, the conventions?
Framework convention applied to the global size.
They may, not always, and you also have non-framework conventions that apply to global concerns. Well, the framework convention, it's a convention that will be completed in the future with other conventions. It means the convention only establishes the frame, okay? So general principles, some basic obligations, and this will be completed in the future by implementation conventions or protocols or new conventions, etc., etc. So that's the case for the Convention on Climate Change. You have a Convention on Climate Change, and you have some protocols, some additional treaties that are linked to the Framework Convention, and that will put some obligations on states on in the following what has been decided in the framework treaty. Well, I don't know if in the framework treaty there is the obligation to reduce the emission of some types of gas. Sorry, the protocols or the additional treaties may contain some provisions stating that the the reduction of the emissions must be of 10% on in 5 years, 10% in 15 years, etc., etc. Okay, means that you have the basic principles in the framework treaty and the commitments of the states, the precise commitments of the states in additional treaties. And of course, in that case, if you have a framework treaty and a protocol, well, let's say in 1992, a framework convention is adopted by states. And if you have a protocol in 1995, well, let's say protocol 1, protocol 2 in 2000, etc., etc. Okay. Of course, when you will have to interpret, let's say, a provision in protocol 2, you will have to take into account this treaty. Okay. You cannot do as if protocol 2 was an isolated treaty. Of course, this protocol has a link with the framework treaty that has been adopted 8 years earlier. Okay, so the obligation to take into account some rules of international law applicable between the parties to the treaty is an absolute necessity in this kind of regime. When you have a framework treaty and when you have some additional treaties related to the framework treaty. Okay, the framework treaty just identifies the basic obligations, the general principles, etc., etc. And then the states will engage in additional treaties, but of course there is always a link, a relation of the additional treaties to the framework treaty. Okay, so this is very very common method used in international environmental law. Yeah.
So the substance is broad and not really specific in the framework treaty.
If let's imagine that in the framework treaty regarding climate change or on climate change, the obligation is, or the treaty will state, okay, climate change is a global concern. States have to fight against climate change, etc., etc. This kind of obligation, very general, nothing really precise. And then in the protocol, you will say that we have identified, or we have identified that this kind of activity generates the climate change, or you have some effects on climate change. Then we try to regulate this activity. And in a new protocol, it will be, well, we have identified another field of activities or another type of activities that may have or that have a negative effect on climate change, then we will regulate this activity in protocol 2, 3, etc., etc.
So the reason to have a framework treaty because they think that the issue is on progress.
Yes, and it is
before the
and of course this is the case for environmental law, because we scientists work on some issues such as climate change, and of course when the scientists discover new things, then you will integrate this into the legal regime. Okay, so you have the framework treaty, and depending on the evolutions of the knowledge of the problem, you will adopt some additional treaties because scientists have identified that this problem, let's say climate change, can be provoked by this kind of activity or this kind of product, etc., etc.
It can be the reason of urgent need of the treaty and the time constraint of concluding the general treaty. It can be like because of time constraint,
Yeah.
and we need the treaty urgently.
Yeah.
So we have
Yeah,
to
and we already have the frame for it. We already have, well, let's say, an assembly of the contracting parties to the framework treaty. So, if you want to organize an international negotiation between states, it's quite easy because you already have the structure, the assembly of the contracting parties to the framework treaty. Okay, so this is really. It's not absolutely specific to environmental law, but because of the evolutions of the knowledge on environmental issues, etc., this is really of common use. It's a really common practice to face the environmental issues or the global.
So it doesn't state much about the state obligation in the
first one?
the treaty. Yeah.
No, well, of course, it depends. There may be some
The obligation is less than.
Yes, and we will put some additional obligations on states with the successive treaties that will be negotiated and adopted and enter into force in the future. And of course, this is a system. This is a legal regime, and you cannot interpret this without seeing what's here. Okay? So if you, well, I don't know if you say that, if there is a word used in that protocol without definition or without a clear definition, and if the same word is used here with a clear definition, of course, the meaning here is the one here, okay? Because there's a clear connection between those two treaties, okay? Yeah. So, and see that here. So that's what an arbitral tribunal said in the Southern Bluefin Tuna case between Australia and Japan in 2000, in an award of 2000. The tribunal said, so it's not the International Court of Justice, it's an arbitral tribunal. The tribunal said that it is commonplace of international law and state practice for more than one treaty to bear upon a particular dispute. There is no reason why a given act of a state may not violate its obligations under more than one treaty. There is frequently a parallelism of treaties, both in their substantive content and in their provisions for settlement of disputes arising thereunder.